Okay. I'm just doing a sound check right now, so tell me your name.
Bruce Vincent.
And where are we?
We are in Libby, Montana, the cultural capital of Lincoln County.
Libby's been here a while, hasn't it?
Yeah, Libby's been here since the 1890s.
Okay. Okay. Tell me a little bit about you, about yourself and what you've been up to and how you got into all this. And
I grew up in this little town. I'm proud Libby logger. I grew up during the days when J. Neal's Lumber Company owned the forest around Libby and the mill in Libby. At that time there was about 1,500 people working in the mill complex, and then a complementary force outside in the woods. So I grew up a proud Libby logger. That's our high school mascot. But I left here and went to college in Portland. And it didn't take very long to figure out the kids I was going to school with didn't look at me as a steward of the forest. They looked at me as an axe murdering Neanderthal. But I murdered trees, enough trees to go to college. I met and married my wife. She's a California girl. And then after completing college at Gonzaga, I got an engineering degree and an MBA. We were living in Spokane and doing the city thing, and noticed one day the kids were playing out in the yard inside a chain link fence inside the city. So we stayed up all night and talked about what we wanted for us. And we're perpetually pleased that there are hundreds of millions of Americans that make the urban choice. But we talked about what we wanted for us and our kids. And we wanted to raise a family in a rural environment that had hard-working, hard-playing, community-oriented, family-oriented, school-oriented, church-oriented people. So we packed our crap in U-Haul and came back home to Libby in 1984 and rejoined the family logging company. The family logging company was started by Mom and Dad in the 60s. It grew up to be a fairly decent-sized outfit. We had 65 employees. This is a small, isolated town, as you could tell getting here. So a lot of those 65 were cousins. That's kind of the way that works. My dad once said, rural people don't wave because we're friendly. We wave because we just don't know. Might be some DNA going by. Hi. So I rejoined the family logging company. Instead of just being a sawyer, I was a sawyer and a business manager for the company. And shortly after we moved back, we figured out that something was going wrong. And what was going wrong was a national focus on wanting to save the forest. And I thought that was great news. The public decided that they wanted to save the forest. Well, there's our common ground. We want to save it too. But the public's version of saving the forest has nothing to do with the forest reality we live in. Because in this country, perception is what leads policy discussions, not the truth, not reality, but the public's perception of reality. And it didn't take very long to figure out that Will Rogers was right. He once said, it ain't what you don't know that's a problem, it's what you know that ain't so that's a problem. And the public knows a lot of it that just ain't so about the forest they want to save. So we started engaging in a program of talking to the public about the forest. And soon after standing up and speaking out, we learned that there were groups that were training people how to appeal timber sales on national forest land. And since there's 3 million acres of national forest land around our town, and about almost 80% of all the land is managed by the Forest Service, what the public wants to do with the public forest becomes really important to hear. And when they decided that they wanted to stop management and using the tool of appeals and litigation, they were very successful in achieving their goal. They convinced the public that the forests had been mismanaged and the way to save them was to stop all management.
About when was that?
That was in 88, 89, right as the spotted owl was taking off in the Pacific Northwest. in the inland west, we had other species. There was a guy named Jasper Carlton with the Fund for Animals out of Boulder, Colorado, that took a special interest in our forest, and he started filing lawsuits, not on the spotted owl because we don't have them here. He started filing lawsuits under the Endangered Species Act on the grizzly bear, the bank-hugging monkey flower, the bastard flax, the Coeur d'Alene salamander, the northern caribou. He had 12 species and started filing lawsuits with the stated goal of having nature commence managing the forest because man was really bad at it. And as his lawsuits were successful, oftentimes not on environmental grounds, but on process grounds, NEPA violations, the Forest Service not crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's in their 3,000-page document. As they started to win that war and shut the forest down, we started losing milling capacity and we started losing our logging jobs. While that was going on, I was traveling around speaking out and asking people to get engaged in the process. NEPA, the process of public engagement on forestry issues, is open to the public. And it was started because of failed environmental policy. So they said the public has a right to have a voice in this discussion. So I started traveling around begging the rural communities to find a voice. Get a voice in this discussion. We have as much right as some kid at Wesleyan College in Connecticut. So stand up and speak out. And we started a rural movement. Our first big activity here was a log haul to Darby, Montana. The sawmill was getting closed because of appeals and litigation on the Bitterroot forest, and they needed some wood. So we decided to haul them some wood, and we ended up with 303 loaded logging trucks from 5 different states showing up one day in Darby, Montana, a town of about 800.
I was there.
You were there?
I was there. I photographed that.
And it was made national news, as you well know. And what I didn't know was that there were other areas that were dealing with this. I knew we were, but that showed me that there were rural timber communities all over the West that were dealing with the very same issues as we were. People wanting to save the forest and saving it to death. Not even knowing that they were doing it, but shutting down management. And it wasn't just a Western occurrence. One of my first calls was from Corydon, Indiana, because on the Hoosier National Forest, they were dealing with the Indiana bat, and it was closing the forest down. Mm-hmm. So we found out this was a national issue. We started organizing the rural communities throughout the United States, and I formed a host of different groups. We formed a group locally that had chapters in Oregon and Washington and Idaho called Communities for a Great Northwest. Then we formed a larger group with farmers, ranchers, miners, loggers, and fishermen called the Alliance for America. And it was about 600 different natural resource sector groups from all over the country. So we began a social movement to find a voice in this discussion over the rural landscape and how are we going to, as a society, deal with it and manage it. So I've been involved in that and traveling, jacking my jaw, talking to anybody that will listen about what we're doing, what we're trying to do. And I've learned a lot. The timber wars taught me...
Hang on a second. Go ahead.
So we began a social movement that grew some legs in communities that were at risk. It wasn't all timber. We knew we needed other allies. So all resource sectors were going through the same thing. The most consumptive society on earth doesn't know where their stuff comes from. And they love stuff on the store shelf and bitch if it's not there. But the process of producing that is not something that they're used to looking at. So any of the resource commodities that include utilizing nature in some fashion were under siege and remain under siege.
Is it the classic thing of where do you get your eggs? The store?
It is.
Yeah.
And historically, we've laughed at the public because they don't know where their stuff. They think that milk shows up in a carton at Safeway, or boards show up at Home Depot, and on sale day a bunch of boards show up, and we've laughed at them. it's not funny, because it's really fertile ground for a fear-mongering conflict industry that makes all their money on the fight over this stuff. And in the early days, we thought we were just competing for ideas. What's the truth? What's reality on the ground? What we ultimately found out is we were dealing with an industry that was spawned out of a very good and right-centered environmental movement. There are some inside that movement that found out they could make a lot of money if they marketed just one product, and it wasn't stewardship and conservation. They learned to market fear and crisis and conflict.
How big of a dollar figure is this industry?
They grew it from an environmental social movement concerned about doing the right thing on the ground into a multi-billion-dollar multinational corporate interest in continuing the fight. Groups like Greenpeace and the Humane Society, and good roots, started for the right reasons.
Right.
But then someone figured out how to make money, and you don't make money telling people we're working with others in this situation and finding a solution. No, you make your money by creating or highlighting a crisis, a crisis, a crisis. They've got to have something going wrong all the time in order to generate income, and they're really sharp.
Sounds like a political group that we're familiar with.
Absolutely. And they're not stupid business people. And when I do a lot of campus speaking now, and when I tell the college kids that these groups that they belong to are an industry, they get upset. But I ask them to look at their corporate flow chart. They have CEOs, CFOs, COOs. They have boards of directors with the fiduciary responsibility to generate a product, and the product is cash. If the head of Greenpeace doesn't know how to make a couple $100 million a year run in the door, he gets his butt fired. You've got to have a crisis. You've got to learn how to maximize that crisis. So they do focus groups and surveys, and that's how we went from global cooling, the coming ice age in the 70s, tough to sell at 95 degrees in New York in August. So then we went to global warming, tough to sell when they're having one of the worst winters ever in the East Coast. So now it's climate change. The weather's changing. Oh my heavens, send money.
Yeah.
And is it a real issue? Yeah, we're coming out of an ice age. 15,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice over where we're sitting.
Really?
So I'm thinking the planet's warming up. And they've monetized that discussion and driven fear into the hearts of people to the point where Greta is traveling the planet saying, now we've got 9 years left.
Yeah.
And what a tragedy. What a tragedy for the population that doesn't really know the background of this entire discussion, because they're trying to make tough decisions. And if they think we've got 9 years left, try to have a conversation with somebody about recycling a can when they think we have 9 years left. It's bite me, I'm going skiing. I mean, if we're that screwed.
Yeah.
So they built an entire industry. We didn't know that we were dealing with an industry. We thought we were dealing with competing ideas on how to take care of Earth. And what happened to us is we made the conflict industry billions of dollars because we inadvertently participated in their business strategy. We were the tit for their tat. When we had the Silver Fire Roundup in Oregon or the Great Northwest Log Haul, we drove our story to the front page of USA Today, where the Audubon Society got to ask America, do you want the marching Neanderthals to whack all of the trees down, or do you want to send us $20 and we'll save the forest? Well, guess who America picked? They didn't pick the marching Neanderthals. So what we had to do was back up and take a look at our strategy. And I've spent the last 20 years working on a solution model. How do we get out of making them money in a fight? Because we're always the bad guys. We're the ones who cut the trees down. They're the good guys because they're the ones that hug the trees and love them. So how do we back out of that and start talking to the public about their long-term desires? What do you want the forest to look like in 200 years? And to a person, people will begin defining healthy ecosystems and biodiversity and clean water and that kind of. So we use what do they want it to look like someday, which is oftentimes defined by a Disney movie. What they really like is wolves raising orphaned rabbits in a sea of old growth. and we have talked to them about the fact that that isn't real. In the real world, the wolf eats the rabbit and they don't have a party right after that. But that is where they come from, and we've got to, instead of laughing at them, we've got to understand that they're coming from the right place. They want to do the right thing in the forest. So we started setting our goalposts out a couple hundred years. If you want a healthy forest ecosystems, let's figure out what that kind of might look like, and then back up to how do we get there. So for 20 years we've been working on that. How do we get to our common goal? In this little town, we are often told, you guys need to learn to sit together at a table. We've had the Coalition for Balanced Environmental Planning. We were the first forest to convene the 7th Annual National Forest Congress. We've had stakeholder group and RAC groups, and we've gotten the people that were having a fist fight in the late 80s, early 90s around tables locally, and have defined what it could look like. So we've been working locally on finding solutions. But it's not sexy work, it's tedious, it takes a long time, you have to build trust with the people you're sitting with, but it's the only way ultimately we're going to find a future. Because we have to talk to the public how forest management is part of the answer to get to where they want to go, a healthy forest. We have to redefine ourselves as not part of the problem, but part of the solution.
Well, in corporate environmental groups, they're not interested, are they, in finding solutions?
No.
Kind of like that one political party. They're just interested in fear, and power. So
the local folks that are members of those groups or have started their own group, 99% of the time you can find common ground with them and actually achieve a solution, because their desired outcome is what the forest they live in is going to look like in 200 years.
Right.
When you get above that, the national, international, they don't care about local solutions. In fact, that's part of their problem. If they solve the problem, they've got to find a new one. Right. So when we're doing collaborations, I'll look around the table and ask myself, who pays a price for a solution? Who benefits from a solution, and who pays a price for a solution? And the people who benefit are usually local, true environmentalists or conservationists, the local public, local industry. We all want a solution, but there are people in the conflict industry that a solution is part of it's not a good thing for their business strategy.
I take it John Kerry's not a member of that.
John Kerry he's learned how to monetize climate change. The weather's changing.
As Al Gore did.
As Al Gore did.
Right, yes.
And anytime somebody monetizes an issue, finding a solution to that issue gets problematic, because solutions aren't the friend of the leaders.
Right.
So we've had to build a grassroots movement from the ground up and define how are we part of what they want to see? How are we part of the solution to what they think the problem is? And we also had to get over our language and our approach to these folks, because, Mike, you remember in the early days of tree-hugging hippies and environmental wackos, and
right.
doesn't do us any favors, because the public thinks that these groups are watching out for their public interests.
Right.
They don't know that they're a business dependent on conflict. So we've got to be really careful how we engage the public, and instead of trying to beat up the environmental movement, take it over. I call it out-greening the posers. They're posing as environmental groups.
Right.
So instead, be truly environmental at home.
Out of curiosity, just as you're talking, some of these environmental groups you're talking about, you know, the wolves that are raising the rabbits and whatnot, has the Forest Service really decided to re-engage Smokey the Bear? Because he was one of the most popular icons for decades. And what's your feeling about that?
Well, Smokey the Bear served a purpose, and they are re-engaging. They're using the caricature, the character again, to talk about human-caused fire ignition, and that's good. What's not so good is the ultimate definition of fire being the enemy of the forest, and Smokey the Bear is the leader in putting fires out. Right. Well, we're paying the price for 100 years of fire suppression right now. Some of these fires should have been burning a little bit of the forest up a little bit at a time. And when we don't have those fires going, and when we don't have mechanical removal of fuel, we end up with the powder kegs we're all living in right now. We have so much fuel. When little fires come in, they end up being catastrophically huge, hot, destructive. So Smokey the Bear needs to be re-examined.
Besides you, who else is, and Jim, who else is doing something on our side publicly that is getting a message out there, and how is it going for you?
There are a lot of local people now that are activists. We don't have the national groups anymore, other than the national industry groups, the American Logging Council, National Forest and Paper Association. Some of those folks, they're still talking about forestry, but most of the activity is at home.
Okay.
In rural communities like this. And
well, I mean, I remember as a kid growing up, Champion, Weyerhaeuser, a number of others did tremendous PR, brochures and tours and school groups and tree planting things. And in my mind, when those CEOs stepped down, retired, who came up through the ranks in the profession, then their jobs were taken over by CFOs, and it just, that PR stuff got cut, and about that time we started losing. We started losing the public and the message.
Yeah.
So
the last major efforts on the part of capital I industry were in the 80s.
Yeah.
The last truly major effort. And then we had a recession in the mid-80s. And the first thing that got cut off was public relations and community outreach, education. And we're paying the price for that, because then the spotted owl hit and all the other issues hit. And they have not kicked it back in like they need to. And part of it is many of the large fee title owners, the people that own industrial forest land, many of them didn't see a future with national forest land. And locking up national forest land even served their balance sheet interest, because as national forest was locked up, their fee title ownership became more valuable. Right. So there were cross purposes in management of the national forest that were not discussed out loud in capital I industry, but they were there.
Yeah.
And the old days engagement, Society of American Foresters used to take nearly every kid in the 5th grade out all over the place and plant a tree and talk about forestry, and those efforts quit. And we're paying a price for not having those regular engagements, particularly with the next generation.
Well, getting back to put out the fire, where are we? How are you guys here as far as fire?
We're sitting in what I call Katrina. Katrina of the forest.
Yeah.
And I use that analogy every time I talk to the Forest Service chief and the folks back in D.C., because all the science shows that we are in a powder keg, especially in the footprint of the 1910 fire. Yeah. 3 million acres.
Is that burning over here?
Yeah.
Okay.
3 million acres in 36 hours. And that ground largely was populated, not in every case, but in most of the landscape, with lodgepole pine. Heat-sensitive cone, pops open during the fire, it's nature's cover crop. But lodgepole has a lifespan here of 90 to 120 years. So it's dead, it's dying, it's ready to regenerate. And everyone knows it. And now we've got an additional fuel problem because for 30 years we haven't been out doing the thinning that's needed to be done. So we have anywhere from 500 to 600 tons of fuel per acre now. Some places way more than that.
What is the normal carrying capacity overall in this area?
50 to 60 tons would be good. When white man first showed up where we lived, there were 50 or 60 largely thick bark trees that would live through intermittent fire to the acre. 50 or 60 trees to the acre.
Indians burned regularly, didn't they?
They moved, as the ice cap was receding, the Native Americans moved in. And trees weren't their friend. It was hard to see their enemy, hard to see their prey. The ungulates that they ate didn't eat trees. They ate grass and shrubs, so they burned a lot. And in this valley, with our bog digs and stuff, we can tell they burned every 10 to 12 years for thousands of years. So when white man first showed up, it was 50 or 60 big, thick bark, pine, larch fir to the acre. And now we have 500, 600 trees to the acre. It's dog hair. And all of the government analysis shows this. We are at risk. In fact, the recent infrastructure money that got dumped on the Forest Service, we were one of 10 areas that was chosen for immediate application of fuel removal techniques because they know we're sitting in a powder keg.
Is that happening now?
That is happening as we speak.
Okay.
The forest had, I believe, 19 million, right at 19 million given to them this year.
But without a mill,
we've lost our infrastructure to process the size of fuel that needs to come off the forest.
So are you ready to go back in the field and log?
Yeah. Well, my oldest boy has restarted Vincent logging in a fashion other than fighting fire. It's way cheaper to do it when the trees aren't blazing. It is. There's a national discussion that we're involved in that is very, very healthy, and that's a discussion about people who work with their hands and make stuff. Mike Rowe and his foundation.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They're talking that there are occupations we're not filling because they have been demeaned for decades as not being quite as good or quite as worthy as white collar jobs.
Those knuckle draggers.
The knuckle draggers. You know, that's part of what keeps the fire in my belly is what happened to my dad in this town. When I was in the 3rd grade, we took the Iowa Basics test to tell how smart or dumb you are. And when the results got back in, the principal and teacher called mom and dad into the school. And it's a country school out here, and in the middle of a logging town. And when they got home that night, I was awake. We lived in a trailer, thin walls. I was listening. Dad didn't know for 30 years that I overheard. But what they talked about was how to keep me from being a logger. Because my dad had been told that night if I ended up being a logger, it was his fault. And for the first time in that proud man's life, instead of looking down at his hands and seeing calluses on his palms and dirt under his fingernails, and a source of pride because it built our company, it built our town, it built our state, it built our bloody nation, for the first time in his life, and tens of millions like him, he was told he didn't have a heritage worthy of passing on to intelligent children. And he wrapped that misplaced mantle of guilt around his neck and wore it for decades.
Wow.
And he wasn't the only one that got that message. I was going to be too smart to be a dumb old logger like him. That's what he heard. And thankfully, I got to work with him for 40 years. And I pray when we put him in the ground that the mantle was gone. Because when we were standing out in this forest looking at a hillside of trees trying to figure out how to apply modern forest management to the hillside, I had 2 degrees hanging on the wall. Dad didn't have a 1, and there was a stupid person standing there, and it was not my father. He had more sustainable forestry information in his brain that came to him through his hands, and he could have gotten with a doctorate degree from Yale. But his was experiential. He learned by doing. And society was taught to discount that knowledge base. Well, they continue the discount at their own peril. We want to do the right thing in the forest. We're going to need smart kids coming back. They should not be the leading export of our rural communities. Young, well-educated, well-rounded children flee our rural areas.
Move to Minneapolis.
We need our smart ones. It's going to take really smart kids doing really creative things to feed, clothe, and shelter 11 billion people and save the forest.
Yeah.
So we need our smart kids back, and we're getting over that hump. Part of it is what's gone on with COVID in the supply chain. Americans are figuring out we don't make any of this crap anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not on the store shelf.
Right.
Right
now
now
it's disappearing.
Yeah. And somebody ought to, and the who ought to, that's where we need to make our moral and ethical argument that if we want to consume, we ought to produce. We have a moral responsibility to produce. Because if we don't and we still like to consume, what we'll do is import our raw products from developing countries that are long on resources, long on population, and short on cash. They'll send us our crap using methods we quit using 30 years ago, and we'll call it green because we don't have to look at it. But America with COVID is figuring out supply chain stuff.
Yeah.
I have a buddy in the military whose friend, his whole job is buying stuff for tanks and crap.
Yeah.
I didn't know that for 15 years the tracks on our military tanks have come from China. That's a problem.
Yeah, it is.
So
when you're buying from your enemy.
Yeah. Could you hand me a bullet? I've got to shoot at you. So the nation is having a discussion that timber is part of about people working with their hands and producing domestically. And part of our future is going to be figuring out how we successfully tie our forest discussion to that larger discussion as being part of the solution. The public is getting what it asked for in our western forest. They wanted nature to do the managing. Well, 500,000 acres at a time, without filing an environmental impact statement, just kind of woof. And the streams that they were wanting to protect are being boiled.
Yeah.
These are issues.
Yeah.
The carbon they want to sequester because of climate change is getting pumped into the atmosphere. So, and the public's figuring it out. They aren't liking the natural management regime. When we're burning cities the size of Paradise, California, in a day, the public's, and more importantly, the important public. I've known forever, if Libby, Montana burns to the ground this summer, the same day Madonna bears half a breast somewhere on TV, we're not the news. But you get 10,000 people just outside of South Lake Tahoe standing on their $10 million home with a $6 hose going, this sucks! And the politics of forestry changes. So the tragedies going on in California have perfected the political discussion of we need to do something.
Well, I remember a couple of years ago when the smoke in Portland was so thick you couldn't see a block.
Yeah.
And then you got people's attention. But it went away as soon as the air cleared. Kind of.
Kind of.
And as the time went on, then it wasn't such a big deal. But boy, when the Columbia Gorge was on fire, you had their attention.
Yeah.
And I think they've already said they're going to be stuck everywhere. You know. So.
Everything though, just one bridge too far. The good news is I used to have to be careful what I talked about when I was at a podium because I'd sound like I had a tinfoil hat on. They really want this stuff. And he's, no.
Here it is.
Here it is. And now they're openly saying it.
Oh, yeah. The Democrats in Washington, that trench is getting deeper and deeper and deeper for them. Good.
Yeah.
You know, good.
Yeah.
So
I'm
not going to throw you a rope.
No. Every time they go one bridge too far, all it's doing is illuminating where they really do want to go. And we have a choice. Mm-hmm. We can choose where they want us to head.
Are there any videos out there that speak to how to engage the people who aren't in our social economic conundrum to educate them? Is there anything you've seen that really does or builds on?
There are some videos and things like Project Learning Tree. There's some decent attempts made. I have not seen a really good video or curricula possibilities that are actually being strategically placed and have people come with that to explain it. One of the things that we need to work really hard on is humanizing our discussion. Because every time we want to talk to somebody about forestry, they get a three-piece suit and tie talking head idea of forestry as it is champion, or it's warehouse, or it's some mythical flowchart in the sky.
Yeah.
What we need to do is humanize it. We need those products. We don't have them, I don't think, Mike.
Yeah.
We have some written form. The Evergreen is the best of that, I think.
I haven't looked through it. I've got a box of videotapes that I've collected over the last 35 years. And there was a lot of good messages on those tapes. They were produced by groups, companies, all kinds of people. And I was just wondering, you know, had you run across anything that really stood out and addressed where we're trying to go? And
no,
we need it.
We need it.
We need it. And I'm more than willing to throw my hat in the ring and say, okay, how can I help?
There are, I don't have his name. The new delivery of those ideas is through social media.
Yeah.
And there's a young guy that was Texas A&M, I think it was. I did a forestry discussion in Texas, and he and a buddy started a podcast. He's a forester, and doing a little podcast that I did the first one with them, and they're going to continue doing them. And that's how the public's getting their information now. It's on their it's on their phone. It's on their iPad. And
I still use cards.
But they'll want to keep it very, very, very local. They don't want to discuss the strategy of the national group they belong to. There's a high school teacher. This last January, I did a thing for OFRI.
Okay.
And they had all the high school teachers that teach natural resources, including forestry, on a virtual seminar that I did a presentation to. And one of the guys is chasing a Mike Rowe type of thing. Oh, yeah. He's doing little short videos about forestry and about fishing and about other things. And he contacted me after that show, and I looked at some of his stuff online, and it's good stuff.
Good.
So there are little efforts going on like that.
Yeah.
What they need to be is led by the Society of American Foresters. Mike, have you ever seen the believability indexes? Have you ever heard of believability?
Oh, I've heard of them, but I haven't seen them. So.
Well, foresters are seen as rangers. They're Dudley Do-Rights.
Ranger Smith.
Yeah. And their believability index is up there around ministers.
Really?
And down around politicians and journalists are loggers. And who's been standing in front of the public? The people with the least believability. It doesn't matter if we're speaking the truth. Our mouth opens and there's a discount put on it because you're a logger. And I begged the Society of American Foresters. In fact, I use an analogy. Forestry is like a Broadway play that America, for the first 200 years, knew was going on.
Yeah.
Because it was happening on every main street in America. We were conquering the continent. But people didn't understand forestry, and they didn't have time to even look at it until the 50s and 60s. They started getting time and money and did 2-week summer vacations, and they'd go out and they'd look at their favorite camping spot, and there's a stump. And they started asking questions. They started looking at this Broadway play, and they didn't understand the plot. They didn't understand what the desired future outcome of the show was. What are you trying to accomplish here? And in fact, they started getting angry because the show was kind of ugly. Logging is not pretty.
Yeah.
There was a beautiful tree. Now there's a stump. Someone explain it to me. And so they were screaming at the stage, "What are you doing to our treasure?" And on stage are the loggers. The props are the trees and our equipment.
Right.
And we're operating based on a script, writing by the script writers and being directed by the directors who are the foresters. And where are they? Hiding behind the curtain. While we're having our props blown up and getting crap thrown at us, they're hiding behind the curtain going, whoa, it's ugly out there. And they should be the ones stopping the show and engaging the audience and saying, this is what we're trying to do.
We got to get some people out there with some balls.
With some balls. Society of American Forester needs to weigh in. So what I ask them is, if pediatricians tomorrow morning woke up and the front page of every newspaper in America was pediatricians kill babies, who would they have go out and defend their profession? Their secretary?
Yeah.
A janitor?
Yeah.
And it's time, if they want this profession to draw in the young blood we need, that understand management, then they need to be the ones out there. Get out of the bunker, get from behind the curtain, and do our 5th grade tours again, engage the public. And I know that foresters, they're scientists.
Yeah.
And they know that the theories they're working on are always in question. They're always getting proved wrong. It's all theory, and they're doing the best they can, but they're not positive. They know they've made mistakes, so they're hesitant to stand up in front of a microphone and testify to the truth because it's moving. Well, the Sierra Club and the rest of them aren't.
Yeah.
They'll stand up and they'll discuss facts. We only have 4% of our virgin forest left. Where does that number come from? But they will flatly state it as if it's truth.
Oh, yeah.
And our scientists, the people with the highest believability in our industry, have been the quietest for 30 years.
One of the things I've noticed, and maybe you've seen the same thing, we're talking right brain, left brain people. You got one side on the wood products that don't want to get caught in a lie anywhere. And the other side will lie through their teeth.
Yep.
Because the end justifies the means.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's part of the dilemma, I think. Before we get going any further, I'm going to run out of room on this reel, otherwise I want to talk about Jim a little bit.
It's central to the entire discussion.
Yeah.
Out in 1988, when we had the Great Northwest Log Haul,
Yeah.
I got a call from Jim, who was at that time living in Grants Pass or Medford, I can't remember.
Grants Pass, yeah.
And the spotted owl was just raising its head at that time. And he asked what was going on, drove up here, and we penciled out a movement.
Wow.
What do we need to do nationwide in order to react to this? We penciled it out on a bar napkin. And at that time, I got introduced to the Evergreen. It was already out and being published by the timber operators in Southern Oregon. And when I was reading that stuff, I learned that here was a journalist, because that's Jim's background. He was a journalist that could take the science of forestry, the white paper discussions of forestry, and turn it into understandable English for the public. And that's worth its weight in gold.
Yeah.
Because we have a lot of science. There's a lot of competing science. But try to talk to the public about basal area per acre.
Yeah.
And what Jim has perfected is taking all of the information that we have that's important to the decision making and putting it in understandable form. Sometimes it's charts and graphs, sometimes it's the written word. But when he produces a magazine, the public can open it, and even if they aren't a forester in the forest industry, they can understand it. Yeah. And that's why I got involved with him. That's why I got involved with the Evergreen, because we need that tool. Yeah. The science part of our discussion for way too long just threw white papers at the public. And people are making emotional decisions on this subject. We've got to speak to them in a way that they understand.
What Jim's been doing this since '88, about.
Yeah, I think Evergreen actually started 86, something like that.
86, 87, and that's about when I met Jim myself, too, and somebody recommended I go down and have a talk with him, which we did. But so we've probably been involved with Jim and known him about the same length of time. And you just answered this, but let me ask it again. What do you think Jim's significance has been to this industry?
I think particularly for the public land discussion, his influence has been incredibly valuable. And we're seeing some of that work now, almost 20 years after the discussion really started to get ripe. Do you remember the book, the magazine that he put out called The Truth About America's Forest?
Yeah.
I think there was over 1 million copies of that made. It was in the early 90s, and it was just a compilation of accurate data on what's the reality of our forest system. And to this day, when I go back to Washington, D.C. and meet with a staff person, they'll pull it out of a file.
Really?
And I hope this next trip I go back, I'll find first put out the fire on desk.
Yeah.
So he has been invaluable in providing tools to decision makers, people that are going to make the ultimate decision, define the rules and regulation by which we manage our land, both public and private. They need an understanding, and our ability to deliver something like this that they can understand is incredibly important. I don't believe we'd have things like the Healthy Forest Restoration Act if the people that were ultimately pushing a red or green button didn't have someone on their staff that had something from Evergreen that explained forestry in a way they could accept.
Did you know Bill Hagenstein? Or were you familiar with him?
The name isn't ringing a bell, but
Okay. He was in Portland. He died 4 or 5 years ago in his upper 90s and still articulate as ever. He was with the West Coast Lumbermen's Association, which morphed into Northwest Forestry and the FRC. And he probably retired during the Spotted Owl era. And but he was, he and Jim were very tight. And Bill was the go-to guy for Congress for many, many years. If they needed funding to build roads for fire, they went to Bill, and Bill went back to Congress, and he lobbied these guys, and he got the money, you know. And he did hundreds of speeches all over the country on forest management and the sustainability of our forests, providing we take care of them, kind of thing. And Jim had often said, in talking about Bill, he says, you know, I've got every speech that Bill wrote. It fills file cabinets. And he says the message was always the same. He says no matter where you look over a 25, 30-year span, he says the message never changed. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, you were thinking about that when you wrote the book, because the message just repeats itself all the way through the book. Yeah, you know.
That's. I do a lot of speaking.
I know you do.
And this year I keynoted the Montana Society of American Foresters annual meeting. And I dug out from my file cabinet a speech I gave to the Society of American Foresters in Montana in 1990. And I gave the same speech.
Yeah.
Our issues have not changed. Our need for engagement have not changed. Our need to articulate the situation in a way that an audience can understand has not changed.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people, AFRC is doing an excellent job of pushing the ball forward. Nick Smith and there are a lot of efforts like that.
Right.
They're not coordinated like we had back 30 years ago when national groups of grassroots folks.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of efforts to provide information, some in the modern social media, some outreach like Nick Smith is doing. Having the information of science that's constantly changing in a form that is palatable, understandable by the public, has, the importance of that has not changed. And that's where entities like the Evergreen, somebody like Jim, who, he's not a forester, he's a journalist. But we need that tool because we only operate with the consent of the public. It doesn't matter if we've got all the science in the world at the University of Idaho School of Forestry or at the University of Montana. If we can't engage the public and have a discussion of that science, we're screwed. And the people, the Bill Hagensteins of the world that are capable of doing that, there's not that many. And
this is one of the things that has impressed me about Jim is that the number of people who are knowledgeable, that he talks to, that he interviews all over the country, and he's just become this plethora of this encyclopedia of information. And like you said, his ability to articulate that is incredible.
Yeah, and it's not in just the discipline of forestry itself. The scientists he's talked with, and now in the last 5-10 years, he's gone, built friendships and written about some of the people that were on the other side in the late 80s, early 90s. Mike Petersen from Inland Empire Public Lands Council over in Spokane. He's developed a friendship with him because some of the people that are truly interested in the forest are changing. They will not follow an anti-environmental dogma, but a true forest discussion and how do we get to our desired future outcome in 200 years, they're into it. And Jim has a Rolodex of those that are truly engaged for the right reason. His brain full of contacts, holy cow.
Yes.
And in all science disciplines.
Out of curiosity, is there anybody on the horizon? I mean, you've been doing this for quite a while, and I've heard you speak, but is there anybody else out there that, Nick Smith,
Nick,
my feeling is we need somebody who is a good speaker, but kind of like Mike Rowe. You know, good looking, captivates people, has some humor. Anybody come to mind?
The young guys that I've talked about in Texas that are doing a podcast, and they're foresters, they're young, good looking, and using new tools. There's not as many as we need. And I don't know if when I first started speaking, I thought there'd be people in droves willing to talk. And there haven't been. There are some. But we need to have an industry-wide development of that. I think Nick's efforts in that regard are incredibly helpful. Because
what about Travis? The CEO of the group Nick Smith.
Is that
AFRC, yeah.
I don't know Travis.
Okay. He's articulate and a good looking guy, and you know but I was wondering, one of the things that I think is that we're facing in our industry is a lot of the people that go into this industry are internal people. They're not outgoing. You know, they get into forestry because they don't have to deal with people.
What we need, what we're asking for, is countercultural. I have a son-in-law that works for the Forest Service. He graduated top of his class at the University of Montana. And he did not get into forestry so he could engage the public. You could whip him to maybe talk.
Yeah.
But, I mean, he's a man of few words when he's excited. And that's culturally the norm. So what we're asking people to do, speak up, is countercultural. But there are some who can. My oldest boy, he's outstanding. My youngest boy, both my daughters. One's a teacher, one's selling real estate now and manages my jaw-jacking.
Yeah.
My youngest boy got an environmental studies degree. He's working down in outside of Bozeman doing building.
Okay.
My boy Chas, he went to the University of Oregon State, wanted to get a forest engineering degree. But his sophomore year, they said to truly guarantee placement, we're going to have you get 2 foreign languages, and we suggest Russian and Portuguese. That was in the late 90s.
Really?
So he quit school, came home, logged for a year, and then got a political science degree at the University of Montana. With a minor in communications, then became our state representative till he was termed out, then our state senator till he was termed out. And now he's got Vincent Logging going. That's what he wants to do.
Yeah.
But he can talk. And we need more like that are willing to stand up and speak what they think to be the truth. And have an understanding of engagement. Some of the folks that stand up, sometimes we wish they wouldn't. Because if we stand up and we are seen as anti-environmental, we're done.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've learned in dealing with mixed audiences is God gave us 1 pie hole and 2 ear holes. And we used the pie hole for far too long without engaging these. We need to listen to the public. They give us the social license to operate or not.
Right.
So we need to hear them. Even if we think they're crazy, we need to hear them. Because whatever they think is real to them. And so we need people that can both listen to the public and then articulate our argument in a way that is environmentally sound. Out-green the posers. Chas, my son, he carried some legislation through Helena, and it was, oftentimes it was 50-50 in our House and Senate. It's more leans right now, but for years it was. And he'd get things passed 99-1.
Wow.
But he learned how to make the environmental argument for what we wanted to get done. And when we can make our environmental argument, we win.
Yeah. We need a school of that. We need some good teachers of that.
Oh, I've thought about that. Want to help teach? We have.
I'm open to anything. So I probably do better with this kind of stuff. But
because we restored a ranger station between here and Kalispell. I don't know if you would ever.
No.
We had a Pacific Logging Congress meeting at Raven Ranger Station.
Okay.
It's CCC built.
Oh yeah.
Ranger station midway between here and Kalispell. And the sole purpose was to have it be a teaching center.
Okay.
And we started bringing kids, mainly we were focused on middle school kids.
Yeah.
And we'd bring them from the city and pair them up with rural kids and have them spend a week going to logging jobs and a ranch and a mine. And my ultimate aim there, we need a teaching center. We need someplace where we can bring people and teach them how to engage the public in a constructive way.
Right.
So someday.
Okay. Well.
Need to figure out how to monetize it. How do you get people to pay for that? And that means the industry has to understand the importance of it. Mm-hmm. And industry still, when times are tough, what's the first thing to get whacked off?
Yeah. anything that isn't bringing money in. So, back to Jim. Kind of in a closing wrap up. What has Jim meant to the industry and Evergreen? You know, I equate those two together. So,
well, since in forestry, and first on public land, but ultimately on private land, the American society doesn't see boundaries. A tree is a tree, and they love it.
yeah.
But in the discussion of forestry in this country, where we only do management with the consent of the public, being able to communicate with the public is central to building a future, building new forestry, whatever that's going to look like.
Right.
And Jim's ability to condense our information in an understandable format so we can share it is incredibly important. And it's going to remain important into the future. Getting some of his stuff, he's 78 years old.
Yeah.
And getting some of his stuff documented, making sure that we've got it archived so that we can continue to share it is important. And then developing somebody who's going to step into Jim's shoes someday.
Yeah.
Because being able to speak with the public, and the Evergreen is a tool chest that does not exist elsewhere. And giving us the science in a way that we can share with the public. Mm-hmm. And the importance of that cannot be overstated.
Good. Good. Well, you've been wonderful, my friend, as usual. So, and just kind of as an afterthought, this has been, I'm just letting this post roll a little bit, so we've got some stuff to edit from. But